close some doors in the back, or is it being left open? Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Ottawa. As everybody around this table knows, we had a change in plans. We were hoping to be in Mexico this morning, and but due to their major difficulties down there, so we switched channels. And so out of a disaster, we had a great opportunity, and that is we have with us today is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As many of you around the table here, many MPs have had the chance to travel down the United States the last few months, and we found it always welcoming. Mr. Murphy, your chamber. We had a great evening with the chamber in Washington. We also had a great experience in California with your chamber, and we had also a luncheon with them. And so thank you very much for coming to our committee. And also, you have a very distinguished group that's come to Ottawa with you. I think there's over 37 members from many of the big companies and producers in the United States. This is a very, very important time, as you know, for our countries, and especially this next few days. So it's great to see you guys here. There's a few things that will probably run a little different than committees maybe in the United States. A few little changes. First of all, there's no pictures allowed to be taken once now that we're in a formal setting. We're going to kind of split this up. We're doing something a little different, Mr. Murphy. We're going to, of course, have you do a presentation. We're usually around 5 minutes, but you can take whatever amount of time you need, and then we'll have dialogue with the members of Parliament. We're going to try to do that for about an hour, and then we'll have a more informal. There will be no cameras, but any time during this first hour, if you have some members that want to sit, they're welcome to sit with you. If you want to ask them up to come now, or if it's a particular question, let's say it would be about milk or something, and you have somebody you want to bring to the table, listen. So it's that kind of there's no structure there. So you can bring anybody to the table and help you answer questions, or give us some information. As you know, our country is a bilingual country, so anybody that needs translation, we have headphones, and there's three channels on there. So English is one, and second is French. Yeah. So without further ado, welcome again. And you have the floor, sir, and then we'll just open it up for dialogue with the MPs. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome, Chairman Eiking and Vice Chairs Allison and Ramsey. It's an honor to appear here today in Canada's Parliament, representing the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the largest business organization in the United States. We represent the interests of more than 3 million companies of every size, sector, and state. Big companies, little companies, manufacturers, service providers, agricultural firms, and we also represent more than 2,000 state and local chambers of commerce, nearly 1,000 sectoral associations, and a network of American chambers of commerce abroad, including one here in Canada. And I should also add that we represent and include in our membership U.S. affiliates of a number of Canadian companies. On the topic of the day, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as we've affirmed since the beginning of the year, we support the initiative to modernize this agreement, taking into account the technological, economic, and other changes in the North American economy and the global economy in recent years. But in our view, since the agreement went into force in 1994, the NAFTA has been a major success for the 3 member companies, for the United States, for Canada, and for Mexico. We have seen a substantial increase in continental trade, cross-border investment. It has stimulated economic growth, and it has raised living standards and improved the global competitiveness of all 3 of our economies. You know the statistics very well. it's more than $3 billion of trade every day. In the United States, as my boss, Tom Donahue, the president and CEO of the U.S. Chamber, often says, trade with Canada and Mexico supports 14 million American jobs. I believe that breaks down as 9 million trade with Canada and 5 million trade with Mexico. So we see every day the benefits of this agreement. Much of this commerce depends on the NAFTA, though, in ways that are not even widely appreciated. And the negotiations that are now underway, we believe, should be conducted in a manner that does not put these current trade relationships at risk. We believe this goal is eminently achievable. Over recent months, we have offered the following general principles for NAFTA modernization. First, do no harm. Interrupting the $1.3 trillion in annual trade across our borders or reverting to the high tariffs that were in place prior to the agreement could endanger many of the millions of jobs that depend on trade in our three countries. Second, we need to work to keep the agreement trilateral. Maintaining the NAFTA's three-party framework is critical, as transitioning to entirely new bilateral agreements presents real risks of trade disruption. Such a transition might also introduce divergent rules, one set for U.S.-Canada trade, one set for U.S.-Mexico trade, a third for Canada-Mexico trade, and that would mean higher costs for industries in a number of sectors. Third, we need to ensure a seamless transition. Chairman Kevin Brady of the House Ways and Means Committee, who I believe you've met with in the past, has emphasized this point repeatedly, the importance as we move from the agreement we have now to one in the future, that there should not be a sharp break of any kind that could interrupt trade. Finally, throughout this modernization process, I should comment that we have heard a number of threats to withdraw from the agreement. We take these threats very seriously. In the view of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, this move, quitting the NAFTA, would be an economic, political, and national security disaster for the United States. And on this issue, my boss, Tom Donahue, issued a column today in the Wall Street Journal, which some of you may have seen. And I'll quote briefly from it. He wrote, undermining the NAFTA would be a grave and costly mistake that would hurt the very farmers, manufacturers, workers, and families this White House purports to protect. Americans should do everything necessary to avert this grievous self-inflicted wound. How might withdrawal happen? At this stage, we think that the risk of it simply happening suddenly through a self-initiated act is somewhat lessened. But what we're seeing at this moment, though, is concern among a number of our member companies about the direction of the negotiations. In a number of areas, we're seeing, including proposals from the U.S. administration relating to investment protections, strict domestic content rules, or a sunset provision that causes significant concern. The alarm is that those kinds of proposals, heterodox proposals not seen in past trade agreements, could lead to a breakdown in the negotiations and a withdrawal. So we are pressing the U.S. negotiators, asking them to bear in mind every day the 14 million American jobs that depend on Canada and Mexico, as well as the millions more in Canada and Mexico. We believe that we can move forward and positively modernize this agreement and make it work for the 21st century economy, and we look forward to working with you to make that happen. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Murphy. And before we go ahead, I'm going to introduce you to my colleagues from. We have three of the major parties of our Parliament here, and on our left we have the NDP. We represent the NDP, Ms. Ramsey, and we have from the Conservative Party. We have three: Mr. Dreeshen, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Allison. And on the Liberal Party, we have Mr. Fonseca, Ms. Ludwig, Madam Lapointe, Mr. Peterson, and Mr. Dhaliwal. Different parties, and we're from all right across the country, so from British Columbia right to the Atlantic coast. So we have quite a representation on our committee. Our committee is also has been quite active in the last few years. Of course, you're well aware, we just finished an agreement with the European agreement, and it's in effect over the last few days, so it's a really big one for us, that agreement. We also did a lot of work on the TPP, which kind of fell to the side, but we did a lot of study and work on that, which of course brought a lot of dialogue with our counterparts in the United States. So our committee is quite active. We're a trading nation, and we're glad you're here. So we're going to go ahead, and what we usually have is 5 minutes. A member of Parliament has 5 minutes, so for dialogue back and forth, and we move it around. So without further ado, we're going to go right to the Conservatives, and we have Mr. Allison. You're first up.
Thank you, and to you, Mr. Murphy, thank you very much for that. I know the chambers on both sides of the border are a valuable asset, so we're glad that you're here today talking on behalf of the U.S. Chamber. I guess my question is this: we've certainly read the papers like you guys do, in terms of what's happening or what's expected, and I know business gets it in terms of the fact we've heard from countless witnesses, and the first thing they say always is do no harm, right? And that was your first point as well. And so my question to you is, what do you think as you look into your crystal ball into someone else's mind about what a win would look like? I mean, we all agree that modernization should probably should have some importance here. I mean, we need a chapter on digital. There's a number of things that the original agreement didn't do. But in your minds, because I mean, obviously they like to see it happen quickly, but it takes a while to make these things happen. What do you think the administration wants to see in terms of a win? Is it a total blow up? Is it a total rework, or is it trying to tweak around the edges? And could that be considered a win for the U.S. administration?
Well, thank you for that question. And if I may, let me just quickly say what we in the business community see as a win first, and then I'll pivot to that quickly. What we're looking for is a modernization that takes a 23-year-old trade agreement and brings it into the 21st century, with provisions, for instance, those relating to digital commerce. When the NAFTA was negotiated, the World Wide Web, I think in that same year, was invented. And so e-commerce, the ability to actually do business online, not just buying a package and having it shipped to your home, but doing business, for instance, doing your online banking, selling insurance across borders electronically, downloading software across borders. These are all evidence that today we don't just trade in goods or services, we trade in digits as well. So we know how to do this. The TPP had language to do that. There are other areas, for instance, in the area of sanitary and phytosanitary standards. More recent trade agreements do a better job than the NAFTA did to ensure that the regulations, the potentially behind the border barriers that can impede international commerce, are based in sound science and therefore are not simply a tricky form of protectionism. So those are examples of the kinds of modernization we're looking for. Now, the Trump administration has emphasized in its objectives a number of issues just like those. There are a few others, though, that have raised some questions. So, for instance, the very first objective in their official document relates to the U.S. bilateral trade deficit. We at the U.S. Chamber do not believe that the trade deficit, the trade balance, is an appropriate yardstick for measuring whether or not a trade agreement or a bilateral trade relationship is working. Rather, it reflects macroeconomic realities. It's no more significant than, in the case of the Murphy household, the fact that I have a trade deficit with my grocery store or my barber or any other retail establishment I go to, but I do have a trade establishment with my employer, a trade surplus with my employer. And there's near universal agreement in the economics profession on that. So it raises questions: what exactly are the trade policy implications of that? To their credit, the U.S. administration has said that they want to expand trade, that it's not by limiting imports that they hope to achieve that goal of more trade balance. But we're waiting for details on that. Another objective that they've laid out is the objective of strengthening the rules of origin in the NAFTA. And we haven't seen specific text on this introduced by the U.S. administration yet. This causes us some concern, though, because The NAFTA already has some of the strongest rules of origin of any free trade agreement in the world. If you just look at the auto sector, which is often at the fore in this, the 62.5% is higher than any other trade agreement. And the concern is that if you raise substantially that level, it's a tool that cannot succeed in compelling industry to increase the North American content. After all, the U.S. external, the MFN tariff that we have on autos is 2.5%. If complying with the bureaucracy and rules related to rules of origin is too complex, too costly, then companies will simply pay the tariff. And so there are a number of real-world examples like that that we continue to try to impress on the negotiating team and try and push them in a productive manner.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. We're going to move over to the Liberals now, and Madam Ludwig, you get the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Murphy, for your excellent presentation. I represent an area of New Brunswick Southwest. I border on the state of Maine, and certainly the gateway to the Atlantic region. And in our area, we've always had, up until recently, duty-free softwood lumber. I'm wondering if you could tell us or inform us how increasing tariffs and countervailing duties on softwood lumber might impact the American consumer, jobs, as well as the economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. The softwood lumber dispute is one that, of course, has gone on for decades, and any number of trade lawyers have sent their kids to college in the various iterations of it. From the perspective of the U.S. business community, of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce specifically, it's a dispute that at times has been difficult for us to wrestle with because it pits the interests of producers against those of consumers. I think my hope over the years, I've been with the U.S. Chamber for about 18 years, has always been that over time we'll see greater integration and less conflict in this aspect of the relationship, which is something that we can say, for instance, in the steel sector. 20 years ago, there were more trade remedy actions in the steel sector than today. Today, the North American steel industry is really quite integrated, and there's less of that kind of tension. But we're not there yet. We're hopeful that negotiators can find a path forward to find a way forward that can address this matter and do so quickly. And I think there's a hope out there that doing so in the near term could provide a boost of goodwill at this point in the NAFTA negotiations.
Okay, thank you. And just adding on to your comment there, Mr. Murphy, about the integrated supply chains, if we look, for example, at softwood lumber, in New Brunswick, there's actually a mill that's half of it. One side is on the American side, the other half of it is the pulp mill is on the Canadian, or vice versa. It's called Twin Rivers. Certainly, that's a great example of
Yes.
integration. And I'm wondering, are Americans, are they acutely aware, somewhat aware, a little bit aware of the possibility that any disruption in trade could mean a loss of jobs on the American side as well, not just on the Canadian side?
I think that the past year has offered a kind of tutorial for policymakers in Washington, in the Congress, over the benefits of the NAFTA today and the trade relationship we have with Canada and Mexico. Last week, I went on a 4-day tour of 7 Midwestern states. These states, one thing they all have in common is that they voted heavily for Donald Trump. And another thing they have in common is that they're all incredibly dependent on trade, and particularly trade with Canada and Mexico. And as I traveled in this area, I visited manufacturers, I visited a large trucking firm, a technology company, a manufacturer of balloons, and I spoke at a number of state and local chambers of commerce. I did not find any reservoir of goodwill for the idea of abandoning the NAFTA.
Okay.
In fact, Congressman Kevin Kramer of North Dakota, at the very first event I went to, said, "I'm not aware of a single constituency in North Dakota in favor of withdrawing from the NAFTA." And North Dakota is about the reddest state in the union, as we say. It's one of the states that voted for President Trump by the largest margin. So and I finished my tour down in Kansas, and Senator Pat Roberts was at the event there, and he's chairman of the Agriculture Committee. It's agriculture that sees this perhaps most vividly, but it's not just manufacturers. You know, Canada and Mexico buy more U.S. manufactured goods than the next 10 largest markets among our export partners. So I think in the Congress, I can see that message has gotten through. I see it getting through with governors as well. And I think that I would have to say that I think Canadian diplomacy has played a positive role here as well. There's been a great deal of outreach, not just from the government, but from our good friends at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, who have hit the road, as you all have, in traveling to a lot of places. So NAFTA's been much maligned over the years, but I think that there's somewhat of a different perspective on it today. And I think opinion polling backs that up. The view of NAFTA is more favorable than it's been.
Thank you, and that wraps up your time. And we're going to move over to the NDP now, and Madam Ramsey, you got the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. My mother's a Murphy, so we have a lot of Murphys on both sides of the border, of course. But I do want to dig in a little further to something you just touched on with my colleague, and that's, you know, kind of what the general understanding is about trade that's happening between the U.S. and Canada and the misinformation. And we saw what came out from Wilbur Ross around the rules of origin around auto last week, or this week rather. And, you know, it was quickly refuted here by Canadian auto industry executives, certainly by representatives from the government. So we are very concerned about the rules of origin and the fact that there seems to be a thought that there is a wider unfair practice that Canada and Mexico are engaging in around this. So I wonder if you have any idea, because as you alluded to, these haven't been tabled yet. It's quite concerning to us. I represent a riding in southern Ontario, right on the border, so certainly a lot of auto. So I'm wondering if you have any idea as to when we can expect this important discussion to begin, and what is the Chamber's position?
Well, thank you for that question. The U.S. Chamber, in our submissions to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, was more or less along the lines of what I articulated earlier, that the rules of origin in the NAFTA are already very strong, and measures to elevate those requirements are likely to backfire, and you could wind up with less North American content. And this is a view that has been articulated in more or less that way by most of the U.S. large business organizations.
So any idea of when that will come forward?
Right. So I think we've reached we're a month into the negotiations. In this area and several others, it appears to be the case that the administration is making some hard decisions internally and trying to move these draft texts through our interagency process and also through the congressional committees of jurisdiction. There's an obligation to consult with the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee.
Unfortunately, we don't have that same process here in Canada. We were admiring it quite a bit when we visited Washington in the spring and met with the subcommittee. There's something else I want to ask you about steel that you touched on. So we're awaiting the 232 decision, of course, which we expected in June and still is lingering, where Canada really is seeking an exemption. So I'm wondering if you're supportive of that. We did meet with the American Steel Institute when I was down there in June with our Steel Caucus, and I'm wondering what the Chamber's position is on a Canadian exemption around steel.
So the state of play with regard to that matter is quite unclear. I believe Secretary Ross recently told the press that any kind of decision is now being deferred until after tax reform is done, and it's really unclear how long that's going to be. It's been a process that has been difficult to follow, and unlike trade agreement negotiations, which are governed by our Trade Promotion Authority law, which sets out very clear consultation with the Congress and so forth, and with private sector. This is the 232 statute is one that hasn't really been used and applied since the 1970s, so it's been a little opaque. So I'm afraid I don't have a good read on what the state of play and or when that's coming out, but it does seem to have, it appears to be the case that
I know that the Canadian Chamber, sorry to interrupt you, is advocating for that exemption, so I just wonder if you've had those conversations with Mr. Beatty and what that looks like in your relationship.
Right. I don't know that I think a number of major business organizations have expressed concerns about it broadly. I don't know that an exemption is one that has necessarily garnered a lot of attention in the sense that Mexico is not necessarily in a different boat, right?
Right.
And so it's clear, though, that some of those concerns have gotten through, and a number of senior cabinet officials have weighed in on that. For instance, appears Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, who's concerned about the application of tariffs against our NATO allies, and in the interest of national security, it's a little leaves you scratching your head.
Just only have about 20 seconds
Okay,
left.
20 seconds. Anything you can give us on your position on Chapter 19?
Yes, on Chapter 19, as I mentioned, I've been at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for almost 20 years, and it's striking to me that during that time, none of our member companies have ever raised it with us as a problem or anything in particular. However, as this has come to the fore in recent months, we have heard from some of our member companies, for instance, in the agriculture sector. You may have seen a letter signed by several dozen agricultural groups concern about getting rid of Chapter 19. So I think that the U.S. business community that's never particularly paid much attention to these provisions is now paying more attention. So we're digging into it and looking. We may in the months ahead have a more formal stance on that matter.
Thank you, and we're going to move back over to the Liberals, and Madame Lapointe, 5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to welcome you. Mr. Murphy. Do those that you represent, 3 million people, I believe, 3 million companies, rather. So, can you hear me? So have these members said that they want this to be negotiated before the end of 2017?
Typically, the U.S. business community has not had a powerful message about the timeline. Typically, we're more concerned about the substance of the negotiation, and this is something we've often said. Okay. We're mindful of the Mexican political calendar, though, and that poses a real challenge for our Mexican counterparts.
Merci. Tantôt, ma collègue...
Thank you. Earlier, my colleague asked about origin labeling. And in NAFTA, there are already very clear, strict rules about this. You mentioned a backfire if the strictness of these rules of origin was increased. What were you referring to?
And raising the North American content requirements.
Qu'est-ce que vous voyez? Qu'est-ce que vous croyez qui pourrait arriver?
What do you think could happen if the strictness of these rules of origin was increased?
In a number of sectors, I believe it is already the case that companies choose not to trade under NAFTA rules and simply trade under the WTO rules and pay the so-called most favored nation tariff, simply because the bureaucracy involved in providing evidence of origin and tracking content is costly in itself. And after all, the most favored nation tariff might be very low. So it does appear to be the case that there is one company representative told me that there's often a Goldilocks rule of content requirement. And if you go above that, then you're not maximizing North American content. You'll actually wind up with less North American content. You may see, for instance, if we're talking about electronics or machinery or autos, you may see, for instance, more content from Asia or Europe.
OK, merci. Comme je vous disais tantôt, ma circonscription...
Thank you. As I said earlier, my riding is a northern suburb of Montreal. There's a lot of aerospace or supply chain for aerospace companies in my riding. How do you see that? How should we address labor mobility within the updated NAFTA? Should we draw inspiration from the TPP or from CITA? is there something you'd like to see about labor mobility?
With regard to labor mobility, the U.S. business community is generally very supportive of measures to allow easier travel of professionals. However, the political complications in the United States Congress are substantial in this area. I remember in 2003, it was the last time that a U.S. trade agreement was negotiated, in that case with Chile and Singapore, and it included some visa provisions. And it's not the Ways and Means Committee, but the Judiciary committees that have jurisdiction over those issues. And the U.S. Trade Representative at the time was raked over the coals and compelled to promise not to address those matters in trade agreements since then. And I think that continues to be the case. So, but the case, it remains that Canada and Mexico, through the NAFTA, have access to unlimited free professional visas. Yes.
Là, vous parlez des professionnels, mais
You mentioned professionals, but if we talked more about technicians, people who can move through all three countries, because we're talking about the automobile sector, that's a very integrated sector in all three countries. So for people who are familiar with that kind of area who could move through all three countries, what do you think about that?
Conceptual reason why, under the existing NAFTA provisions, there shouldn't be a category that would allow that to happen. I think there's a widespread view that the categorizations need to be modernized, but in fact that could be done. That's something that has been done in the past already. I think about 10 or 15 years ago. So it doesn't require a full-blown negotiation of the NAFTA to alter that, and that's something that I think there's support in the business community. I think in the current political moment in the United States, it's regarded as somewhat sensitive, but it's certainly technically feasible.
merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Madam Lapointe. And that ends our first round. We're going to go into our second round now, and we're going to start off the Liberal Party. Mr. Fonseca, you got the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Murphy. It's great listening to you and your perspective. We've had the opportunity as a committee to travel from coast to coast in the United States, many of the cities. Actually, we were in Colorado, near your alma mater, in Boulder, as well as in Denver. And we heard how just interwoven the beef industry is. So being the breeding, the growing, the processing, et cetera, and how it crosses border a number of times before it hits kind of somebody's plate. You know, we've heard from many chambers, and they all seem to be on board that we want to modernize NAFTA, we want to make NAFTA that much stronger, better. But when we look at the public and we think back to the U.S. presidential election, or even during our elections in 2015, and now the upcoming election in Mexico, and we were going to have the opportunity this week, unfortunately, due to a catastrophic earthquake that took place down in Mexico City, we had to change our plans. It would be good to hear from Mexican counterparts and as well as their chamber. But I want to get your take. I know you've done a lot of work in Latin America. Your take for how this will play out in the Mexican elections. I'm sure they're talking about it already, NAFTA and this trade agreement, and how that is playing out today.
Well, it's a good question, and I have my view, but I'm sure along the process here you'll have representatives of Mexican industry and other Mexican stakeholders. You know, the recent political developments in the United States have complicated U.S. relations with Mexico in a number of ways. I don't have to point out to this committee some of the rhetoric we heard during the electoral campaign, or even substantive debates now underway, such as relating to deportations and the deferred action for child arrivals, DACA, or for that matter, the proposal for a border wall. All of these proposals have been, according to public opinion polling in Mexico, had an undeniable impact on attitudes, and it remains to be seen how it will shape the electoral contest taking place in July of next year. So it is my view that within the Trump administration, there's an awareness of these political realities. I think that over time, there's more and more of a sense that these are negotiations not just with a potential real estate partner, but with nation states that have their own domestic politics. And going forward, it's going to be increasingly important to understand those and not engage in actions that could have an unintended consequence in terms of impacting the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Mexico in an enduring fashion.
When we look at trade deficits or surpluses, I know between Canada and the United States we're about $680 billion a year. It's actually a surplus last year for the United States, about $1.5 billion to Canada's deficit. When it comes to Mexico and the United States, it's about 60 some odd billion dollar deficit. Do you feel that at the tables, when you're looking at leveling the playing field when it comes to labor, environmental standards, et cetera, is that a place to address and close that gap between the United States and Mexico?
Yeah. So with regard to the U.S.-Mexico trade balance, I would just first quickly reiterate our view that one shouldn't focus on it. It's the wrong yardstick for trying to measure success or failure in a bilateral trade relationship. But beyond that, it's interesting if you dig into the numbers. You're right that there is an approximately $60 billion merchandise trade deficit. But if you include services, it goes down to something like $45 billion. And if you actually measure trade and value added using an OECD database that measures this, which takes into account where things are actually made and how much U.S. or Mexican or Canadian content may be in individual articles, that U.S. trade deficit shrinks even further. I mention that just to point out that the devil's in the details, and these headline statistics can mislead a great deal. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But
well, I just was running at the tables with labor as well as environment. Would that be able to address that gap?
So I believe that that's the hope, but this is a real conundrum, though. The goal of reducing specific U.S. bilateral trade deficits is articulated often by the administration in Washington. How you do that is less clear. As I've argued, rules of origin it's a weak read. It's not a tool that can really deliver on that score. And having rules like those that we negotiated in the TPP, which is generally, I think, the direction that the U.S. administration is trying to go when it comes to labor, having those in place, it could help. But there's not none of these proposals, is there any kind of a mechanistic guarantee that it's going to alter the trade balance. So, but I stick by my original point that if you're worried about the trade balance, you shouldn't. It's the wrong yardstick.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Fonseca. Mr. Ramsey has an obligation she got to go to, and she asked me if she can be moved ahead on the speaking list to get her 3 minutes in. I have no problem, but if there's no objections from the committee, we can. No objections? Okay, Ms. Ramsey?
Unanimous, yes.
Thank you,
yes.
sir.
Go ahead, Ms. Ramsey. And
Thank
we'll
you,
go
and I
Mr.
apologize
Grecian
that I
after.
have to leave. But I think I would be really remiss if I didn't talk about something really serious to us here, and that's our supply managed sector, and certainly our dairy sector is quite concerned over what could potentially come across the table. So I wonder if you can give us some insight. I see here listed you have several dairy groups with you in your contingent. So I'm wondering if you can provide us some insight into what it is that your dairy partners are seeking in NAFTA.
So it's unfortunate that I don't believe that they're actually here in the room at the moment, because some of us are doing multiple meetings at the same time. I'd be very happy to have them circle back with you with a more accurate response than I can give.
That would be great.
This is an area that has been very much in the news, and I don't want to do it.
No, I just, if they have anything publicly, if they put anything out that you know of in your chamber, we would be happy to receive that here.
Yes.
So then I'll flip over to another issue that's important to my region and that we noted in the 18 pages, and that's the de minimis. So looking for the de minimis to be raised to $800. So I'm wondering if you can speak to your chamber's position on that. I'm sure you've seen the Canadian Chamber's position, so I'm just curious as to what your position is on the de minimis.
So we're strong supporters of a commercially meaningful de minimis level. We believe that there's evidence through studies conducted in a number of jurisdictions that show that the tariff revenue foregone by having a higher de minimis level is actually more than compensated for with the increase in trade and the economic growth that follows from it. And we do regard this as an important issue that we should address here. In our earlier conversation, we were talking about, what are things that can address, like the Canadian negotiators want to find ways to boost Canadian exports. We believe that this is an area that would, in a legitimate way, help trade and help consumers on both sides of the border.
We have about 40 seconds.
Okay, there we go. So I'll just ask you quickly about the timing. There's been a lot of concern here in Canada about how fast this process is and that there's that short window of time, 11 days in between. I wonder if you can speak to whether or not the Chamber feels that this is the best representation of this scope of trade talks.
So we're torn because we're mindful of, particularly with regard to Mexico, the political calculus there. And so we've been supportive of the idea of moving relatively quickly. But at the end of the day, we're a business organization that represents our member companies, and consistently our line is always the substance needs to drive the timing. And so it's important to get this agreement right. So I'm sorry about the fudge of an answer there, but yeah.
Thank you, and that wraps up the time. And we're going to move to the Conservatives now for 5 minutes. So we got Mr. Dreesen. Go ahead, you got the floor, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Murphy, for being here today. I had the opportunity last week to speak with Karen Harbert, your Global Energy Institute representative, and to talk about some of the issues as far as energy is concerned. And coming from Alberta, I mean, that is something that's extremely critical as we look at some of the issues that have been a challenge for us lately, and certainly seeing the Keystone the Keystone pipeline finally moving forward is something that certainly is appreciated there. And of course, the Chamber of Commerce certainly a valuable asset, and we've had some discussions on small business tax fairness, and so we've been relying on our chambers of commerce to kind of get some word out there. So it's important, and the work that you do coming here to talk to us about this is also very important. You had spoken about the Chapter 19 issues, and you had said that there's some ag groups that had an issue with that. I wonder if you could tell me which ag groups those are.
So, yes, I'd be happy to find a copy of the letter and share that with you. This was a collection of U.S. agricultural organizations that had they expressed concern about the U.S. administration's interest in doing away with Chapter 19. So in essence, it was a position that was somewhat aligned with that of the Canadian government. So it was many of the largest commodity groups, and it's interesting to see them focusing on this issue, which, as I said, has been one that U.S. business and agriculture community has not really focused on much in the past.
Great, thank you. The other thing you had mentioned, just listening to what you had spoken to Ms. Ramsey, you had said a commercially meaningful de minimis, which some people suggest it should be identical, but at least it gives people some leeway to be able to discuss what that would mean to each country as you're looking at the type of industries that are associated with it. So that's a positive aspect, I believe, as we work from there. Getting back to the agricultural side of things, so you're talking about sanitary and phytosanitary provisions, the significance of making sure that things are done via sound science. And I think this is so important, especially as we talk about moving cattle across the border, the different ways in which inspections are done when cattle are coming north into Canada versus Canadian cattle going into the U.S. There's differences there, and I know that the cattle industry has talked about this immensely, about how that should be dealt with, and of course when we have these, that is one of the areas where the border is very thick, and it causes a lot of issues. So I think that's an important part. Have any of your members talked about how one could look at trying to bring those regulations closer together?
So I don't have specifics, but generally speaking, the kinds of regulatory cooperation initiatives that we've seen in recent years have a real constituency in our membership. The Regulatory Cooperation Council is a program that we've been very supportive of, and we've seen some modest progress in a number of sectors. Certainly in agriculture, that's the case. I got an earful about this when I was drafted by some of our member companies to be the co-chairman of the Cool Reform Coalition. This is the U.S. Business and Agriculture Coalition that lobbied for the U.S. to alter its country of origin labeling program to comply with the WTO ruling. But certainly, again, the American public may not be very aware of it, but as in manufacturing, where we make things together here in North America, it's also true in agriculture, and we need to find ways to make that work better.
One of the other issues that has come up, because we have companies that are on both sides of the border, Canadian companies that have been bought up or trying to be bought up by Chinese companies, and the concerns about safety and I think this is something that we know that there are some concerns that the U.S. government has. Do any of your affiliates concern themselves with these kinds of issues?
About Chinese acquisitions of
Canadian companies that are also then dealing with U.S. companies?
Well, it is a matter of considerable interest at the moment in Washington. Senator Cornyn, who's the number 2 ranking member of the Senate, is at work on a bill to reform our CFIUS process. That's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, where we have a process that looks at acquisitions from abroad if there's a national security concern. So it's narrowly focused on national security. It's not an economic test of any kind. But there's growing interest in that area, and I think it's multi-sectoral, even though a lot of it's in the tech sector.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
wraps up your time, Mr. Dreesen. And we're going to move over to Liberals now. Mr. Dhaliwal, you got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Murphy, welcome to you and your team.
Thank you.
You're mentioning that, and even when we were traveling through the U.S., we did not find a single person, that's against NAFTA, and they're all willing to work together among 3 nations. And you have also mentioned that even presidents, state like North Dakota, they have voted in big numbers, and they are saying that they're advocates of NAFTA. So what is it there now, like Chamber of Commerce, the local governments, the business organizations, private enterprise, they all want this to move, and what is it that is stalling from the U.S. perspective?
So what's driving it if, in fact, the business and agriculture community is not fully expressing serious concern about the NAFTA? Well, there is, as I've mentioned, a case for modernization of the agreement in a number of areas, and that's sincere and substantial. And the U.S. Chamber shared in the formal process of the Government of Canada soliciting input, we shared a document that outlines a number of points in that. But beyond that, it's, President Trump, as a candidate, was successful and won election by speaking to concerns, particularly across the U.S. Midwestern states, that appear to relate to social and economic change in that region. to some degree about immigration, to some degree about manufacturing job loss, and NAFTA was blamed. And it's a tale as old as time that the benefits of trade are spread diffusely and the costs are borne narrowly. And that's been true with trade. And it's also true to the degree there has been manufacturing job loss in the United States. But U.S. manufacturing employment peaked in 1979, and it's been on a downward trend since then, even though U.S. manufacturing output has doubled and even tripled since 1979. So U.S. manufacturers are just more efficient than ever. They make more and more stuff with fewer and fewer workers. So I think we live in a time when candidates can tap into those legitimate concerns, and what I think we in the business community need to do is find a way to channel those concerns into ways that will deliver real practical solutions, whether it's apprenticeships, helping people get on a highway that's going to take them, through the appropriate kind of schooling and to real jobs in the private sector.
On the other hand, I come from British Columbia, and the major issue that we face every 10 years is the softwood lumber issue. Right? Do you see any permanent fix than signing these agreements every so often?
Do I see a permanent solution?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not the solution that policymakers, I think, can bring up and impose, but I do think over time there's going to be more and more integration in this sector, and that will make these kinds of trade disputes less likely. I do think it's interesting that we're having this conversation now in the wake of the hurricanes that hit Texas and Florida. There's a huge amount of rebuilding that has to take place, and it's estimated that steep tariffs on softwood lumber would only add pretty substantially to the cost of those new homes that have to be built. So that's an interesting point that I'm sure is being delivered home to U.S. policymakers right now.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy, you want to go?
Got a half minute, but
I'm okay then.
You're all good? Okay. Mr. Murphy, you had talked about trade and how, the economic benefits and how it sprinkles across, and I think you're speaking to the converted here. We are kind of a nonpartisan when we travel. We all believe it. But I think the other thing we find, especially going to the United States, is the bonding we have with individuals, right, of that connection when you're trading, you're talking back and forth. And I think it also bodes well, when our countries have conflicts in the world and how we work together. So I think it's so key that trade, it goes in. Recently, I guess it was a few years ago, I was in Egypt, and they were just signing a deal with, I think, Jordan and Israel, which way back they're so-called enemies. And somebody said they're not going to do a lot of trade, but they're talking more. And I think it's so important that we recognize not just the economic part of trade, it's just how that bonding between countries and people and individuals. We even have marriages back and forth, and we trade hockey players. There's so much going on. But it's sometimes when we have a situation like this where it's all on the table of it, I think it shows us more on how much we have, and it's more of a statement, and you can respond to that if you want.
Well, I think it's an excellent point, and for the United States and Canada, it's so obvious. We all know NAFTA families, and in fact, my middle name is from a French-Canadian ancestor, so it's very common. But perhaps a better example, though, right now, is to think about Mexico's progress in recent decades. I was a student in Mexico in the 1980s, and young people today wouldn't remember this, but the United States, let alone Canada, was a very distant place from Mexico at that time. There was a single McDonald's in Mexico City, and middle-class families would take their children there on the weekend, and it was this very exotic thing. But the English wasn't spoken anywhere, and America seemed so far away. And if you think about the journey Mexico has taken since then, Mexico joined the GATT in 1986, wasn't even a member of the GATT, had very high trade barriers. And then a few years later, the NAFTA. Mexico made a transition to democracy, and Mexico today has a much more robust middle class and has become a major player in the world economy. Mexico back then used to just export oil. Today, exports manufactured goods. It's much more sustainable kind of economic prospects. So, yes, trade makes big changes in society, doesn't it?
Okay, thanks. And we're going to move over to Mr. Carey now. You got the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Murphy. I think an excellent presentation, and I really did like your examples. On this side of the table, we do have a trade deficit with my barber too, but the good news is, as I'm getting older, there's a lot less for her to do, so it is getting better.
That's, I feel you.
I also like what you said. We make things together in North America. So I come from Oshawa. We build cars, and there's a lot of rhetoric out there right now in the auto industry, a lot of talk of protectionism. And I think even yesterday I heard one stakeholder say, well, don't worry too much about it or something along that line. We'll just revert back to the Canada-US free trade agreement if NAFTA falls through. And I was wondering if you could comment on that type of rhetoric, why that might not be a good idea, what kind of risk to jobs that might be in Canada, but also the US, and if you could put it in the framework of international competitiveness. You mentioned the importance of this being a trilateral agreement. What kind of effect would that have if this protectionism rises, and what kind of risk to jobs on all sides of the border are we looking at?
The debates about the NAFTA over the years have been complex over many years, and yet that's not where we are. We're not debating, this isn't 1992 or 93 trying to decide whether or not to forge ahead with this agreement. It's 2017, and it's been the law of the land for decades. And industry has accommodated itself to this, and sector after sector have grown used to it and come to use it in a way that, to take it asunder would do great harm. And my boss, Tom Donahue, in the Wall Street Journal today, included the Chamber's estimate that hundreds of thousands of jobs could be at risk. It's hard to game out how exactly that would all unfold, just how dramatic it would be. And we've used the figure often that economic studies, multiple studies, come up with the same sort of number for the United States of about 14 million American jobs, depending on trade with Canada and Mexico. If you took away the NAFTA, those jobs wouldn't all disappear. We traded with Canada and Mexico before NAFTA. But we're talking about a macroeconomic event here that would have very broad repercussions in the U.S. economy. And potentially larger for Canada and Mexico, but as a representative of a U.S. business group, we want to call attention to that risk for it's very substantial for the United States as well.
I was wondering if you could comment as well on the idea of multilateral versus bilateral. You brought that up in your initial comments, and I know your organization in January came out with a very supportive statement for TPP. It basically brought new standards for international trade agreements. And with what we're talking about in NAFTA, I agree with you. It's not 1992, but some people are still living there. Why is it important for us to look at this multilateral versus bilateral, especially when we're talking about our competitiveness as a North American bloc internationally?
Well, this is a question that journalists often ask us, and we try to avoid answering because
I'm glad I asked you.
When I'm asked, do you support multilateral or bilateral trade agreements? We typically answer yes. There's many bilateral trade agreements the United States has entered into that have been good and meaningful and brought real benefits to both parties. But multilateralism as well. We are strong supporters of the global rules-based trading system embodied in the World Trade Organization. the rule of trade law, and what has been built in the aftermath of the Second World War in terms of trade liberalization worldwide has played a very important role in a rising prosperity around the globe. And it's easy to see it in emerging economies like China, but I would argue that it's countries like the United States and Canada that have benefited the most. So we're going to continue to be staunch supporters of multilateralism.
And somebody who's not a Canadian organization, with TPP, do you think there's still a benefit for Canada to still move forward and see what can be done with that agreement, even if the United States, at least for the time being, has said they're not going to be part of it?
So the United States is withdrawn from the TPP and not participating. When we're talking about this with the U.S. administration, we usually at that point say, well, I understand, but what's the strategy then? By the year 2022, 2/3 of the world's middle-class consumers are going to be in Asia. They have rising purchasing power. They love American goods, and yet there are high barriers. So if it's not the TPP as a strategy to access those markets, what is it? So, but as for Canada and whether or not the so-called TPP 11 should proceed, you know, as an American, I salute Canada's clear-eyed pursuit of its economic self-interest. And the TPP, in our view, as we said loudly and clearly for a long time, as we advocated for it, it's a good agreement. And can it be improved? Yes. There were some sectors of the U.S. economy that would have hoped to improve some areas, but it is very clear to us that the Japanese, for instance, want to play a long game with the TPP. They want to see it move forward someday with the United States. And I think that's interesting. But for now, the United States is going to remain on the sidelines of that conversation.
Well, thank you, sir. Good discussion, and we're going to have our cleanup man, Mr. Peterson. You got the last 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Cleanup. I don't often get to bat cleanup. I'm usually number 8 or 9 batter, so I appreciate this, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Murphy, for being here. And I think it's appropriate that we're in Parliament itself today for this committee hearing. And it was, I think, long before NAFTA was around, 1961, I believe, President Kennedy, a couple hundred feet that way, addressed the Canadian House of Commons and said the following: geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. And of course, this was long before NAFTA was around, or the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement. But I think those sentiments remain true today. And I think your testimony certainly highlights some of that partnership that we like to see maintained throughout, beyond any renegotiating of NAFTA. Economics has made us partners is the key thing, I think, for our purposes here. And that's part of the reason I think why NAFTA is so important. And I think President Kennedy was alluding to the partnership between Canada and the United States of America's countries. But there's also partnerships. The local level partnerships, obviously at the business level, there are subsidiaries on both sides of the border from parent companies. So this economic partnership far exceeds anything beyond just two nations and two countries. And that's, I think, key that we keep in mind. That's important to remember. And I'm from an area of the country that relies heavily on auto manufacturing. Magna International is headquartered and has a lot of operations in my riding. Thousands of my constituents' jobs depend on a robust manufacturing center. The company is thriving and doing quite well, and I, of course, would like to see that maintained. So I appreciate you being here today. But I understand that you've been through a lot of, involved with a lot of trade deals through your professional role. And I just wonder if you can elaborate a little bit in the few minutes we have left on what sort of are the hallmarks of trade deals that you see are successful. I agree with you that the trade balance or deficit is not the best barometer. So what sort of measuring stick should we be using? What characteristics of trade deals do you see as successful? And should we strive for if we're striving to improve this trade deal?
Well, thank you. It's an interesting question. You know, in some ways, this NAFTA modernization is just quite different than other trade negotiations. And it's, first of all, a difference because we already have an agreement in place, and it's I think I would have to say it's really quite a good agreement. It's often said that it needs to be modernized and it's old, but I've been impressed that some of the controversies of the past year have caused sectors and individual companies to come forward and share with us, gee, we didn't even know it, but we were using the NAFTA to do this, and it turns out that it's actually pretty important to us. So it is a peculiar negotiation because of that. We have, there are a number of areas where we can pursue through negotiations enhanced market access to one another's markets, but it's fairly limited because the NAFTA already delivered most of that. That makes it different. I think about past free trade agreements between the United States and Latin American countries. There was always the enticement of that market access. And for the Latin American country, the promise of permanent access to the giant U.S. market. And that made it possible politically to enter into not just the market access, but the rules provisions of the trade agreement, whether it's intellectual property protection or procurement rules or opening up services markets. For a reform-minded government, the market access and those other things, it was a chance to enter into a set of economic reforms that might have been difficult to do under other circumstances. So that's what makes this a little different here today. And I think it calls for we need to constantly remind ourselves of what we've got right in front of ourselves. As George Orwell said, to see what is in front of one's nose requires a constant struggle. And I think that's true when it comes to the NAFTA.
I agree with that. And just, I think I have a few seconds left. I think perhaps part of any concern with trade deals is the sentiment that citizens, people aren't sharing equally in the benefits, and you alluded a little bit to that. Is that, do you think, more of a sort of communications problem than it is an actual subjective problem with the trade deals, particularly NAFTA?
Well, I think it's both. I think people don't identify the degree to which so many of their consumer goods are much less expensive, that there's greater competition in the marketplace in a way that brings more choice as well as lower costs, that's missing. And it's easy to say that in those narrow specific places where there's been manufacturing job loss, that trade's to blame. Sometimes trade is to blame, but there's research by Ball State University that says that 88% of manufacturing job loss is due to automation, not due to trade. So it would be to everyone's benefit, I think, if we had a clearer-eyed assessment of, those are challenges, they need solutions, but you need to understand the problem so you can get the right solution.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, and that wraps up the dialogue with the MPs. Good conversation, and Mr. Murphy, we are going to be going down to the States Wednesday. We're going to Columbus, Ohio.
Excellent.
And we have some very robust agenda, and then we're going to go up on Friday, I believe, Thursday, Friday, we're going to do Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So meeting with a lot of companies. So it's, we've been down there a few times, and the West Coast, the East Coast, and down to the center. We've been in Detroit, and so when you're down there, you get the feeling, and you meet with other companies, and you get the sense pretty well how you wrapped it up today. So thank you very much for coming and bringing your people here today. That ends the formal part. We have set up there's some niblets, there's, you name it. It's all there. So we have an informal meeting, and you guys can have a coffee, tea, and we can have just an informal chat. So, but that ends the formal part, and we all hope everything goes well in the next few days and upcoming months for all of our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.